Hey everybody, this is Erica. I'm going to talk to you today about, to give you some historical background for how we got this thing that we call the Bible. And I'm going to split it into 3 separate videos. The first video will be explaining something about composition. How did the Bible come to be written down so far as we could speculate? And what might be the process by which those materials came together. The next piece is going to be about canonization. How did the particular materials that we have coalesce into one body of work, and how did that body become the definitive and only set of texts that would be considered authoritative for the Christian church? The final video will be a section on dissemination. Now I'm going to focus on England, where Quakerism began, and think about how did the Bible come to be known in English in accessible and inaccessible form for ordinary people and people like George Fox and other seekers who came to read it for themselves. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to see if I can share a little PowerPoint with you for the first part of this. And let me get back to my beginning. Here we go. Yeah. So what is this thing that we call the Bible? So first of all, it's important to keep in mind that this is a collection. This is not a book. And in ancient times, what writings in this part of the world were being preserved on was animal skin scrolls. So these are, by their nature, they break down, so they have to keep being copied just to be preserved. And often when they're copied, changes happen, okay? The other piece is that they are, a scroll is only so long, so it's going to be a collection of things, and a collection that doesn't have the same kind of linear order that a codex, the modern book, has. Okay, those are some things to keep in mind when we think about scriptures. Is really a more proper way to think about scriptures, meaning writings. There are a variety of kinds of literature in this collection. So under the category of poetry, I've listed a number of kinds of poetry that we get. We get laments, we get hymns. Most prophecies are in the form of poetry. Most proverbs are in the form of poetry. There are story poems like the Song of Deborah, the Song of Moses. There are love poems, as in the Song of Songs, and of course there are psalms, which are liturgical poems. There are narratives, and lots of different kinds of narratives. Different scholars will categorize them differently, but here are all these different kinds of narratives, including the Gospels, apocalyptic visions, origin stories, national stories, hero tales, etc. There are laws, there are ritual texts, there are epistles or letters, and we could name many more, but one of the things to keep in mind about the variety in this literature is that you read different kinds of literature with different expectations. When you read a comedy, you have different expectations than when you read a tragedy. So in similar ways, when you read poetry, you have different expectations and different conventions than when you read history, for example. Another thing to keep in mind here is that usually when we read about an event, and this is just assuming it's a historical event because not all of the events written about are historical, but the events that are historical are almost always written about much later than they would have occurred. And that's going to affect how they're described. So the events purportedly happened between about 1500, to be conservative. Some people put the patriarchs earlier than that, and say 150 BCE, and now I'm talking about Old Testament. But the writings about those events probably date from 850 BCE, maybe 900, maybe a little bit earlier, but a lot of people doubt that. But those would have been not really just the source writings, not what we have now as really biblical texts. And most of the compiling would have happened during the exile and after the exile into the Hellenistic period. So a lot later than they're happening. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. For the New Testament, there's a much shorter period of composition and a much smaller gap between events and their writing, but there's still a gap. And so when you think about Jesus' life and death, figuring that he died probably around 30 CE is for Common Era, the Gospels are written probably about 40 years after that. And Paul's letters are actually probably the earliest New Testament texts and date from maybe 50, but they tell us very little about the historical Jesus. They say very little about Jesus's actual life or ministry. So these stories are pretty far from the events that they're describing, and we probably shouldn't think of them as reliable historical sources, certainly not in the modern academic sense. They're often going to be preserved and writing about events as those events become significant. And so often they're telling us as much about the events that have become important at the time of the writing as about the events that are described. There are going to be many authors, and occasionally we get some explicit clues about sources. So here are just 3 examples. In Numbers, there's a mention of the book of the wars of Yahweh. So evidently this is a source that the author was consulting. In 1 Kings, we have mention of a book of, a book of the Acts of Solomon. Sorry about that. A book of the Acts of Solomon and a book of the Annals of the Kings of Judah, and there's an Annals of the Kings of Israel. So all of those are books that the authors were consulting that have not survived, but that they assumed their audiences would know and have access to and could look at for further reading, but they were excerpting those. So, that's just an example of how this is very much a sort of group effort, a community effort to be thinking about biblical authors, not an author. And even where there's a traditional author, for instance, it's traditional to ascribe the Psalms to David, to ascribe Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs to Solomon, and to ascribe the Torah to Moses. But scholars don't really think that those works are actually, certainly not all, the work of those individuals. Okay, usually the sources are not named. And yet there are sometimes distinct sources, probably written documents, that you can discern from clues in the text. And here's an example where that is clear. There are at least two different sources, and scholars have named these P and J, P for priestly, J for the Yahwist, that give two different versions of the flood story. And we know they're different because they're actually details that can't both be true. In the J source, it describes taking one pair of each kind of animal into the ark. The P source describes one of each kind of animal, except for the clean ones, which have 7 pairs each. They use different names for God. There are different sources for where the flood waters come from, and the floods last different amounts of time. The reason that I think all of that matters is because I think it's important to notice that the authors left these supposed contradictions in the text. They found it more important to include the different traditions than it was to make sure that there were no inconsistencies. And I think it's later that we try to pretend that those inconsistencies aren't there and explain away that diversity that is in the text. Here is the most likely scenario for how the Bible came to be written. Let me get my face out of the way. All right, so we had these different kinds of material, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list here, but you have the different poetic materials, probably writings ascribed to different prophets. You have different traditional poems. Maybe some of them are oral, maybe some of them are written down. You have different legal corpora. You have different narratives. You have different stories that are in the culture already. And some of these have been brought together in particular collections, and one of those that's really likely to have been brought together prior to the exile is what scholars call a Deuteronomistic history. And this is what we now in Protestant Bibles look at as the historical books. It's the books of Joshua through 2 Kings, and it pulls together a lot of that material that's like the annals, the royal records, and it shapes it into this morality tale that says the reason that these things that we were defeated is because God is punishing us. And this is thought to have had a first draft after the fall of Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. This happened in 721. We think there were probably refugees from Israel that came to Judah, and at this point sort of put together some of these materials, giving it a more a spin that was sort of more favorable to the kingdom of Judah, and that there was this sort of earlier version that then becomes one of the sources that is put into an expanded version during later periods. And there seem to be at least 3 different, what we'll say are redactions or editings of it. Likewise, you get what eventually is known, eventually, as the Torah of Moses. That's also could be called the teachings of Moses or the law of Moses. And I just made this sort of diagram to show that there's a lot of narrative in the beginning, there's a lot of law in the after Genesis, and there's narrative throughout. There's poetic material interspersed throughout. But I don't want to give you the impression that this is all written at once. This seems to come together in several really big moments, and there are moments of existential crisis. There are moments when the people of Israel or Judah are asking themselves, are we even going to survive? And asking, what is it that their children need to know to continue? Who are they as a people? And in these moments of crisis, they bring together these traditional materials to answer those questions, to give their people a narrative, a story of identity, what they see as the correct ways of worshiping their God Yahweh, of continuing, and of saving themselves, because they believe that the reason that they had come to the brink was because they had not been faithful enough. I want to pause for a moment to think about who these writers would be. These are most likely a group of people who are the intelligentsia of the culture. They're likely to be people who already were scribes of the court or priests of the court. Remember that if you have scrolls, you need to keep copying them every so often because scrolls disintegrate. And as you are a copyist, as you copy the words very carefully to reproduce them by hand before printing presses, you get intimately familiar with these traditions, with these texts. These are the people who are most likely then to know the traditions well enough to either know them by heart when they go into exile, or to rescue written traditions, bring them to Babylon, write them, and sort of draw them together in, like, put legal texts into a narrative framework where they're part of a story and not just an esoteric set of laws that only a few people know. And this group of people being intelligentsia who are part of official bureaucracies like the royal court, who kept court records, or priests who were part of a priestly family, are all going to be men. And they're not only going to be men and not women. There are a few exceptions to, there are some female roles at the temple, but not in the priesthood, and there are female prophetesses, but it's really unlikely that they are scribes that we know of. So I say that because it's just so, I'm so aware for my own self that this is a partial story of what all of the traditions of Israel were. It is also a particular group of men. It's men who were not the peasant class. It's men who were not living in the countryside. It's men of Judah and not the northern kingdom of Israel. And furthermore, the Judeans who went into exile and then attempted to come back, they're the ones whose story we follow. And sometimes we can get glimpses of the other people that were around in the culture from what they say about them, and most often the way that they describe them as being blasphemers and wrong. And part of my interest is always trying to ask, if they had a voice to speak for themselves, what would they say? But I just raise that because in our time, I think it's also important to bring a critical lens as well as a sympathetic one, and one that tries to glean from these texts the wisdom that they could have. So we have this collection that's an eclectic collection, and as it's recopied over time, it grows. People who continue writing it add their own pieces, and the earlier that process is, the more fluid it is. As a text gets real authority, there seems to be a lot less freedom for scribes to add their own comments or add their own things. But it does seem to be the case that they do more adding than they do subtracting. And so we see evidence of the different voices. And this is one of the things that I think is really special about the biblical text, is because we do have preserved some variety still in the voices, and that is something actually to celebrate. So that's a really quick description of the texture and process by which the Old Testament came together. The New Testament, that period would have been much shorter. It would have started in, as I said, probably in the 70 CE, or the Common Era, is a date that we choose because it's the date when the temple was destroyed again in Jerusalem. And some of the Gospels show some awareness of, or some trauma even, from that event and all of its repercussions. And so it seems like the Gospels are, even if the traditions in them don't all date from that time, that they weren't written down until after that. So you have the different Gospels being written for different communities by different writers around the Mediterranean world. Matthew has a very seems to have a very Jewish audience. Luke seems to have a more Gentile audience. Mark's audience seems also Jewish, probably Palestinian. And John, not clear, maybe Alexandria, but these are each written for different communities. And it's interesting that about those Gospels, there was never dispute as we get into canonization that they would all be included. And so we, again, have this preservation of multiple voices. Paul's letters are originally written as not private letters, they're written as letters to early church communities that are usually experiencing some kind of crisis, whether it's his absence or a conflict among them. And then there are letters that are written in imitation of Paul, that claim to be by Paul, but that scholars can see through stylistic differences are copied. You know, like they're pretenders, they're pseudonymous. And then there are a few letters that we call the pastoral letters that are written to early church communities. Those are probably the latest. So these coalesce in the first several centuries into a collection. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the next section when we talk about canonization.